And thanks for inviting me back yet again to the National Farmers Union. This is, my home, so you can't really keep me out. But you can certainly keep me off the podium. So thanks for just letting me have a little time here to talk a little bit about setting the stage for the history of this whole framework concept of food sovereignty. And let me just set the context a bit. This is in the mid-'80s, and for the first time, the international GATT negotiations, the Treaty on International Trade, included agriculture as a very key component. I mean, agriculture had been on the trade agenda, of course, but this was a global initiative to make sure that barriers to agriculture trade, to foodstuffs, would be removed and this is, I think, a key part, would be consolidated in such a way that they would be hugely efficient, which meant, of course, that it would be very concentrated. And we in Canada, we in the Farmers Union, had already experienced some of this, what this means when they remove barriers to trade. We had already entered into the Canada-US trade agreement at that time, which we in the Farmers Union fought valiantly, I must say. And when I look back at some of that stuff, I think we were, not to brag about us, but just to take our places, we were very prescient in saying that if you allowed trade in agriculture, in foodstuffs, to be focused on export, import, removing barriers, it would affect all of us, and it would concentrate power with the bigger player. And when we look right now at what we're experiencing with that bigger player, and since then, of course, Mexico came in earlier, it wasn't that, but if we look at what the US is now doing in terms of exercising their power, because we gave them permission to reorganize and reorchestrate our food systems, I think, as I said, we in the Farmers Union were very prescient in saying, look, this is dangerous. Right now, they're friends. In the future, they may not be. And that's what we're now experiencing. In any event, at that time, when we were fighting the trade agreements, internationalizing the trade agreements under the WTO. I was at that time the women's president of the Farmers Union, and we had built good relationships with the women of Nicaragua, the Nicaraguan Farmers and Ranchers Union. And so we had good ties with them, and they knew who the Farmers Union was. And when the leadership of progressive farm and peasant organizations got together in 1992 in Managua, hosted by UNAG, the Farmers Union was invited. So our then president, Wayne Easter, went down and was part of what was that first declaration, that first moment when peasant small-scale farm organizations around the world looked up and said, look, we're all in danger, whether we're north or south, east or west. Farming communities are going to experience huge changes, which will be to our continuous disadvantage and dismantlement if we don't step out and protect ourselves, try to protect ourselves. And that was the genesis of the Via Campesina. By 1993, they were called together in Mons, Belgium, and Farmers Union had a representative there. And in the founding moment, in that Mons document, the Via Campesina declared quite clearly that this would be an organization that would defend rural life, would defend land, would defend small-scale, healthy, ecologically sound peasant agriculture, farming the land and for people of the land. By 1996, and by then I was president of the Farmers Union, we met in Tlaxcala, Mexico, and that was the first big delegated convention for the Via Campesina. That's when it wasn't just the leadership, but delegates from many countries. I mean, at that time, there were 69 organizations from 37 countries in Tlaxcala. And we, I must say, although we had helped to organize that, we were blown away by the diversity and the energy and the wisdom in that room of some hundreds of delegates from around the world. We hadn't expected that's how the power of that gathering would be concentrated in that way. We knew that there was concern, there was anxiety around the world, but we didn't know about each other, and we didn't know the strength of the peasant movement around the world, the movements. So at that time, we sat together and we thought, okay, we have to have a framework within which we are all building towards the same future, protecting what we have and building better. So it was not hard, I have to say, in those meetings. It wasn't difficult to see what we were fighting against. We all knew we were fighting against the destruction of our rural communities, destruction of our environments, the destruction of our cultures, our livelihoods, local markets, and basically the usurpation of rural and agricultural life by transnational corporations. I mean, that's what that GATT negotiation was supposed to do. It was supposed to remove the barriers, and we were clearly, small-scale agriculture and our local markets were clearly a barrier to that transnational agenda of opening up the world and concentrating the marketplace. So we knew what we were against. We were against that neoliberal agenda. And we were also, of course, in many of our cases, quite clear that our governments in those negotiations were colluding with that transnational agribusiness sector, the financial sector. So we weren't naive about what we were up against. We knew what we were fighting against. What was hard for us was to try and imagine, how do we shape the conversation to express what we're against in a way that makes sense and pulls people together, and where we can actually build a sort of global solidarity of resistance against that, but more than that. And that was a difficult conversation. I remember in Tlaxcala, midnight, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, we're sitting together, the small group of us, leaders and many translators and delegates and so on and so forth, struggling with how we would frame this, what kind of language we needed. We knew that that conventional language of food security wasn't good enough, because we weren't just grappling with food security, we were grappling with power and democracy. Who controls food producing sectors? Who controls land, water, seeds, genetics, and for what purposes? So we knew that there were enormous political dimensions to this struggle. It wasn't just a question, and we farmers like to focus on that because that's our job. It wasn't just a question of how we produce and how much we can produce, which was very much the conversation of food security. It was also a question of who controls it, who's in charge, who has agency over food, over our menus, over our land, over our water. So we crafted the term, and it had been in use, of course, but not in this way, of food sovereignty. And the food sovereignty term, we thought, would provoke the necessary discourse about power, freedom, democracy, equality, everybody has agency equally, justice, sustainability, culture, so that food would be taken out of the realm of being primarily a market commodity, which was what the global trade agreements were focusing on, a market commodity, and food would be re-embedded in the social, ecological, cultural, and local context as a source of nutrition, of livelihood, of meaning, and of relationships. And that's an altogether different way of thinking about food and thinking about who we are in food systems. We're not just producers of commodities to be marketed for the highest price. That's not who we are. So it was that kind of language. The food sovereignty term came out of that. And in the end, it doesn't capture everything, of course, but at least it provokes that conversation about power in the system rather than just productivity. And then a few months later, we were in 1996 at the first World Food Summit in Rome. And that's where the Via Campesina really made its statement. And we drafted a small pamphlet, which also represents quite a bit of after midnight work, I have to say, where we sort of tried to lay out what we collectively in the global peasant movement at that time had thought were some of the key components of food sovereignty. And that was actually a very interesting food summit because the GATT negotiations were well underway, had been actually concluded in 1993, and the global stage for agribusiness had been set, and the major food summit was very much focused on a lot of wringing of hands about the 850 million people who are not eating well, who are starving, etc., in the global food system. And the leadership was very much focused on how do we get more food production so that all those people can be fed, which seems like a credible agenda. But then in stepped, and at that time it was Monsanto and some of the US delegations, in stepped the agribusiness sector, and they said, we have the solution, GMOs. That's where we're going now. We have a new technology of production which is actually going to solve the problem of hunger. And you could just see where that was going. Food security would be increasing production and increasing international export trade. And who did we think would be in charge of all that? I mean, it was a play that had the ending already written into it, no? And then we in the Via Campesina and a lot of social movements actually stepped up with us and said, no, we have a different view of what the food system has to look like. And as a matter of fact, folks, food security will not be attained by the methodologies that you're outlining. As a matter of fact, a lot of that has already created a lot of disruption in rural communities and a lot of migration into urban areas and across borders and a lot of hunger and distress and destruction. So that's not the agenda. The agenda here is food sovereignty. And we need to revision and rethink food systems fundamentally. We need to include and challenge the political power, the ownership, the control over seeds, resources, control over markets, in ways which actually serve the people who are producing food, farming, people of the land, and need to eat healthy food. That's what we need to do. We need to revision it. We need to think about food not only as a commodity, but primarily as a way of nutrition. We need to think about the right to food, everybody's right to food, and that food has social meaning, cultural meaning. And I often say, you know, part of our job in the Farmers Union is to re-embed culture into agriculture. And you see it in the new language. I only have 2 minutes. Okay. Let me just finish that sentence. You see it in the language. So much of the language now is around agribusiness. Culture has dropped right out of it. And that's not accidental. And it's our job as those who are people of the land to ensure that culture and our agriculture are again reunited as they should be in such a way that we have the ecological and the relationships within the food systems that are healthy and sustainable. So at that time, I'll stop here, but at that time, we were very clear that the food system will be hugely ecologically destructive, will not feed people, will poison the earth and poison our bodies and pollute the waters unless we recapture control of it with the people and the movements whose job it is to grow food and protect communities and re-embed and re-envisage the relationships we have. Not only, and this is, I wanted to say something more about that, but not only about the relationship to the land and water, but the relationships to each other. Equality and democracy and agency means that we treat each other in ways which are also healthy and sustainable, and not power over, but power with. And that's who we are as the Farmers Union, and that's why we're part of the Via Campesina, because power with is an enormously powerful force and is absolutely necessary for our futures. I stop there.